A glass bulb flared with a sudden impossible white intensity in the suffocating black of a back-alley slum. Shadows that had ruled Oakhaven for centuries recoiled against the brickwork like living things retreating from a blade. The Shadow Watch inspector's oil lamp flickered and died, unable to compete with the searing radiance of the captive star. Arthur Penhaligon held his breath, watching his own trembling fingers turn blue as the freezing thermal tax drained the heat from his veins. A heavy iron boot crunched on broken glass somewhere in the darkness, signaling that the guild had finally arrived to silence the light. Arthur crouched behind a stack of rusted crates, his right arm dangling limp and numb at his side. The bulb in his palm hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that defied the laws of the soot-choked city. He felt the familiar biting sting of frostbite creeping up his wrist as the vacuum-sealed filament demanded a final sacrifice of warmth. The alleyway remained deathly silent, save for the rhythmic metallic clinking of approaching armor. He tucked the glowing prototype into his heavy woolen coat, stifling the light with a thick layer of fabric. The surrounding darkness rushed back in, heavy and oppressive, pinning him against the damp mortar of the wall. He counted 3 distinct sets of heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing off the narrow stone corridors. These were the Shadow Watch enforcers, their uniforms woven from light-absorbing fibers that rendered them nearly invisible in the gloom. Arthur pressed his back against the cold stone, praying that the residual glow beneath his coat would not betray his position. A beam of dim, sickly yellow light from a guild-issued lantern swept over the spot where he had been standing seconds ago. The inspector paused, his nose twitching as he sniffed the acrid scent of ozone lingering in the stagnant air. Arthur gripped the edge of his coat, his paralyzed fingers refusing to obey the frantic commands of his mind. He knew that if they found him with the device, the guild would not just kill him, they would erase his existence from the city records. The inspector's heavy boots moved closer, the metallic soles scraping against the slick cobblestones. Arthur focused on his breathing, slowing his heart rate to match the steady, dripping rhythm of a nearby leaking pipe. The enforcer reached out a gloved hand, brushing his fingers against the very crate that shielded Arthur from view. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, feeling the bitter cold of the thermal tax radiating from his own skin. The inspector grunted, dissatisfied with the empty alley, and signaled for his subordinates to move toward the main thoroughfare. Arthur waited until the clatter of their departure faded into the distance before he dared to move. He crawled out from behind the crates, his legs stiff and uncooperative from the sudden loss of body heat. He navigated the labyrinthine slums by touch alone, his hands mapping the familiar jagged edges of rotting wooden fences. Every street corner in Oakhaven was monitored by the guild's gaze, their oil-fueled surveillance network never blinking. He needed to reach his workshop before the patrol returned to sweep the sector for the source of the flash. He slipped through a narrow gap in a storm drain, the smell of industrial waste and coal dust filling his lungs. The workshop sat at the end of a forgotten cul-de-sac, its windows boarded up with splintered, rotting planks. He fumbled with the heavy iron key, his numb fingers struggling to turn the lock in the rusted door. Inside, the room was a chaotic sprawl of copper wiring, glass shards, and half-finished sketches of vacuum-sealed housings. He collapsed onto his workbench, the prototype sliding from his coat and rolling across the scarred wooden surface. It still pulsed with a faint, dying light, the carbonized bamboo filament dimming as the chemical reaction slowed. He reached for his charcoal pencil, intending to document the success of the experiment, but his hand spasmed uncontrollably. The cost of his innovation was etched into his skin, a web of white, frost-bitten veins marring his forearm. He looked at the blueprints pinned to the wall, realizing that the guild's monopoly on Lux-tier oil was finally vulnerable. If he could stabilize the filament, he would not need their mines, their refineries, or their brutal, oppressive taxes. A sudden, sharp, metallic thud echoed from the front door, vibrating through the floorboards of the shop. Arthur froze, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at the heavy iron handle. The door groaned under the force of a heavy boot, the wood splintering around the deadbolt. He scanned the room for a weapon, finding only a heavy soldering iron and a stack of discarded metal plates. The door burst open, revealing the silhouette of an enforcer standing against the backdrop of the city's eternal, smog-filled night. Pinned to the exterior of his workshop door was a crimson seal, the mark of the guild's liquidation squad. Arthur realized with a sinking dread that they had not just followed him, they had been waiting for him to return home. The enforcer stepped into the room with a deliberate, crushing weight. His armor reflected the dim, flickering light of the dying prototype. Arthur scrambled backward, his heels scraping against the grit of the workshop floor. He reached behind him, fingers curling around the cold, heavy handle of a soldering iron. The enforcer raised a heavy, brass-plated gauntlet toward the workbench. His fingers clamped around the glowing glass sphere with casual, brutal force. Arthur lunged forward, a desperate shout dying in his throat. The enforcer pivoted, backhanding Arthur across the jaw with a gauntleted fist. Arthur spun to the floor, the taste of copper and iron flooding his mouth. He watched from the shadows as the enforcer examined the captured light. The man's eyes widened behind the dark, polarized slits of his helmet. He tapped a small silver dial on his wrist, activating a short-range transmitter. A sharp, static-filled voice crackled through the quiet space. The enforcer reported the recovery of the unauthorized energy source. He tossed the prototype into a lead-lined containment box at his waist. Arthur's vision blurred, the room swaying like a ship in a storm. He saw the enforcer reach for a canister of volatile Lux-tier oil hanging from his belt. The man doused the workbench in a thick, amber-colored sludge. Arthur's heart skipped a beat as he spotted a discarded matchbox on the floor. He lunged, his fingers fumbling in the thick, oily residue. The enforcer didn't even look down, simply raising his heavy boot. He slammed his heel into Arthur's shoulder, pinning him firmly to the floorboards. The enforcer struck a match, the small flame casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. He dropped the burning splinter into the pool of oil. Blue flames erupted, licking at the wooden beams of the ceiling. The enforcer turned, walking toward the exit with rhythmic, heavy strides. Arthur struggled against the crushing pressure on his chest. The heat intensified, thick plumes of black smoke swirling into the rafters. He grabbed a heavy metal wrench lying inches from his outstretched hand. He swung blindly, the cold steel connecting with the enforcer's armored shin. The man stumbled, his balance shifting for a fraction of a second. Arthur scrambled away, his lungs burning with the acrid stench of sulfur. He dived through the narrow gap in the side wall, tumbling into the alleyway. Rain began to fall, cold and biting against his overheated skin. He turned back, watching his life's work dissolve into a towering inferno. The orange glow illuminated the entire cul-de-sac, casting long, eerie silhouettes. He saw the faces of neighbors peering from behind rotting shutters. They watched the fire with expressions of terror and hidden curiosity. The light of the bottle had been stolen, but the concept remained. Arthur pressed his trembling hands against his chest, feeling the frantic pulse of his heart. He slipped into the darkness of the neighboring alley, his breath coming in jagged gasps. He had no prototype, no blueprints, and no home, but he had the memory of the light, etched forever into his mind. He navigated the shifting shadows of the lower city, avoiding the main thoroughfares. Every street lamp he passed flickered, the guild's oil supply sputtering in the cold. He reached the edge of the industrial sector, where the pipes hummed with pressurized fuel. He leaned against a rusted steam valve, his body racked with tremors. A group of laborers walked past, their faces smudged with coal dust. They whispered to each other, pointing toward the distant, glowing plume of his workshop. The word spread through the crowd like wildfire in a drought. He heard the phrase, "sun in a bottle," repeated, spoken with a sense of hollow hope. Arthur pulled his ragged coat tighter, hiding the frostbitten skin of his forearm. He turned toward the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city's foundation. The guild would search the ruins, but they would find only ash. He reached the heavy iron grate of the drainage system, prying it open with his fingernails. The smell of stagnant water and ancient decay rushed up to meet him. He descended into the dark, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar. He walked for hours, his feet dragging through the slick, uneven ground. He reached a small, hidden chamber, once used for storing emergency supplies. He sat on a damp stone bench, the silence of the underground heavy and absolute. He closed his eyes, visualizing the internal structure of the filament. He started to scratch complex equations into the soft, wet clay of the floor. The guild's grip on the city was absolute, but their power was finite. He knew now that light did not require their oil or their taxes. It only required a spark and the courage to keep it burning. He worked through the night, his charcoal pencil replaced by a sliver of jagged stone. He mapped out a new design, one that used scavenged parts from the city's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic thumping echoed through the tunnel walls. He froze, his ears straining against the oppressive silence of the deep. The Shadow Watch had a sophisticated network of seismic sensors in the lower levels. He had been too careless, too quick to return to his work. He stood up, gathering his makeshift notes into a tight, leather-bound scroll. He moved toward the far end of the tunnel, where the ventilation shafts met. He heard the metallic clatter of heavy armor echoing from the main entrance. They were moving fast, their tracking hounds sniffing the damp, cool air. He squeezed into a narrow crevice behind a stack of rotted, waterlogged crates. A beam of bright, artificial light sliced through the darkness of the tunnel. The enforcer's voice boomed, bouncing off the damp stone walls. He ordered his subordinates to secure the perimeter and seal the exits. Arthur watched from his hiding spot, his breath held in a silent, agonizing prayer. The enforcer moved closer, his lantern sweeping across the floor of the chamber. The beam landed on the wet clay, highlighting the complex diagrams Arthur had carved. The enforcer paused, his head tilting as he studied the intricate, glowing math. He shouted a command to the others, his voice laced with sudden, sharp urgency. The guild did not just want to destroy the inventor, they feared the invention. Arthur slipped further into the dark, his fingers brushing against a loose stone. He pried it away, revealing a narrow vertical shaft leading toward the surface. He began to climb, his muscles screaming in protest against the strain. The air grew thinner, the smell of coal dust giving way to the crisp, freezing wind. He emerged onto a rooftop, the city spread out beneath him like a dying beast. The smog hung thick and yellow, obscuring the distant, flickering lights of the upper levels. He looked toward his workshop, now just a charred, smoldering hole in the distance. He knew he could not return to the ruins, nor could he stay in the shadows. He needed to find the others, those who whispered of the sun in a bottle. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the first hint of real dawn appeared. It was not the artificial yellow of the guild's oil, but a pale, natural gold. He realized the city was changing, the foundations of the guild beginning to crack. He stood tall, the cold wind whipping his hair against his face. He had lost his home, but he had found his purpose in the fire. He jumped to the adjacent roof, his movements fluid and purposeful. The hunt had begun, but he was no longer the prey. He was the spark that would ignite the city's long-awaited, inevitable dawn. Arthur stepped into the opulent parlor of the Vane-Smythe estate. Velvet drapes blocked the afternoon sun, keeping the room in a perpetual, expensive gloom. Beatrix Vane-Smythe sat behind a mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver tea service. She wore a gown of deep violet silk that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. Her eyes tracked Arthur's movement with the cold precision of a predator observing a wounded animal. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, his right hand buried deep in his coat pocket to hide the tremor. He placed a single small glass bulb on the center of the polished desk. The filament inside was a thin, delicate thread of carbonized bamboo. Beatrix leaned forward, her gaze locking onto the object with a hunger that bordered on obsession. She did not touch it, fearing the fragility of the work. Arthur demanded a steady supply of high-grade tungsten for his next set of prototypes. Beatrix laughed, a dry, melodic sound that lacked any warmth. She slid a map across the desk toward him, her ringed finger tapping a specific warehouse near the docks. She claimed the guild stored their private reserves of refined tungsten in that unguarded facility. Arthur looked at the map, his eyes scanning the route marked in red ink. He noticed the slight hesitation in her posture when she pointed to the guard rotation schedule. She wanted him to raid the guild's armory to create a distraction for her own political machinations. Arthur realized the map was a trap, designed to lead him directly into a Shadow Watch ambush. He bowed slightly, masking his suspicion behind a facade of desperate gratitude. He accepted the map with a steady hand, despite the ache radiating through his shoulder. Arthur left the estate, his boots clicking sharply against the cold marble floor. He walked toward the crowded bazaar of the lower sector, where the air tasted of sulfur and grease. He approached a merchant selling rusted scrap metal from the deep-crust mines. Arthur pulled a handful of copper coins from his pocket and tossed them onto the wooden counter. He asked the merchant for the current price of tungsten on the open market. The merchant sneered, quoting a price that was 10 times higher than the previous week. Arthur tapped a rhythmic code against the metal scale on the counter. He whispered a technical detail about the guild's current oil refining failures. The merchant's eyes widened as the realization of the guild's instability took hold. The market price of tungsten began to fluctuate as whispers of the information spread among the traders. Arthur knew that if he could convince the dealers the guild was collapsing, they would dump their stockpiles. He watched the merchant scramble to secure his inventory, the man's face pale with sudden greed. Arthur turned away, leaving the chaos of the market behind him. He had no intention of hitting the warehouse Beatrix had suggested. Instead, he headed for the district where the independent blacksmiths operated. These men worked in the shadow of the guild, using scrap to survive. Arthur reached the workshop of a man known only as Silas. The forge roared with a heat that reminded Arthur of the high cost of his own work. He held up a small, hand-drawn schematic of a vacuum sealing press. Silas studied the diagram, his calloused thumb rubbing the edge of his apron. Arthur offered the design in exchange for the tungsten Silas had hidden under his floorboards. The blacksmith hesitated, glancing toward the street where a guild inspector patrolled. Arthur waited, the silence in the workshop punctuated only by the rhythmic strike of a hammer. Silas finally nodded, reaching into the darkness beneath the workbench. He pulled out a heavy lead-lined box filled with dull gray metal rods. Arthur took the tungsten, the weight of it grounding him against the encroaching cold. He felt the familiar drain of the thermal tax beginning to pull at his vitality. His vision blurred at the edges, the world darkening to a pinprick of light. He gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles turning white as he fought the paralysis. The air in the workshop grew frigid, frost creeping across the iron tools on the table. Silas recoiled, his breath hitching as the temperature plummeted in the small room. Arthur pushed the schematic toward him, his voice a strained rasp. He warned the blacksmith to hide the design until the guild's patrol passed. He staggered toward the door, his legs feeling like leaden weights. Outside, the street was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the guild's oil lamps. Arthur pulled his coat tight, the frost on his skin stinging like 1,000 needles. He looked toward the Vane-Smythe estate, a silhouette against the smog-choked horizon. Beatrix thought she had found a weapon in him, but she had underestimated his adaptability. He had secured the material without firing a shot or triggering an alarm. The underground market for conductive metals began to crash as word of the guild's failing supply chain spread. Arthur walked into the labyrinth of the city, his shadow lengthening behind him. He knew the hunt would intensify once the guild realized the tungsten was gone. He touched the cold metal in his pocket, a spark of defiance igniting in his chest. The city remained dark, but for the first time, he held the power to change the light. He disappeared into the steam-filled alleyways, leaving the guild's traps empty and useless. The game had shifted, and he was no longer a pawn in Beatrix's grand design. He was the architect of a new, inevitable illumination. Arthur navigated the narrow gap between the brick tenements. He felt the heavy lead box pressing against his ribs. His heart hammered against his chest like a trapped bird. The alleyway floor was slick with congealed oil and refuse. He paused near a steam vent to catch his breath. A thick plume of white vapor obscured the mouth of the street. He watched the shadows of the guild inspectors sweep across the opposite wall. Their iron-shod boots clicked in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Arthur pressed his back into the damp mortar of the alley wall. He counted the seconds between the heavy thuds of their patrol. He pulled a small, jagged piece of mirror glass from his inner pocket. He angled the reflective shard to catch the dim light of a distant gas lamp. The image in the glass showed 3 silhouettes moving toward the market square. They carried long, wick-fed lanterns that cast flickering orange hues. Arthur waited until the sound of their clanking gear faded into the distance. He moved quickly, his boots silent on the discarded rags littering the path. The tungsten rods in his pocket felt unnaturally cold against his hip. He reached the entrance to the lower ventilation shafts. The iron grate was rusted shut and choked with thick black grime. He gripped the vertical bars and pulled with every ounce of his remaining strength. The metal groaned, a high-pitched screech that echoed through the empty corridor. He slipped through the narrow opening and tumbled onto the concrete floor below. The air here smelled of stagnant water and old metallic dust. He stood up and wiped the oily residue from his palms onto his trousers. A series of glowing blue conduits ran along the ceiling above him. These were the guild's primary power lines for the lower districts. He reached into his satchel and retrieved a small, hand-cranked pulse generator. The device hummed with a low, vibrating intensity. He pressed the copper leads against the primary conduit's casing. A bright violet spark jumped between the contact points. The blue glow in the pipes flickered, then dimmed to a dull gray. The entire sector plunged into a sudden, absolute darkness. He listened as the muffled hum of the city's ventilation fans stuttered and stopped. This was the signal he had promised his contact in the resistance. He walked toward the service ladder bolted into the far wall. The iron rungs were slick with condensation and freezing to the touch. He climbed toward the upper levels of the city's forgotten infrastructure. The metal bit into his skin, leaving faint red indentations on his palms. He reached the top hatch and pushed it open with a soft clack. A sliver of moonlight spilled into the cramped maintenance shaft. He emerged onto a high catwalk overlooking the grand plaza of the district. The statues of the guild founders stood silent and imposing in the gloom. He saw a group of men dressed in dark, hooded cloaks gathering below. They carried heavy crates marked with the seal of the Vane-Smythe estate. Arthur watched them move with the practiced precision of professional thieves. He recognized the man leading the group as one of Beatrix's personal enforcers. The enforcer signaled toward the loading dock of a nearby warehouse. Arthur pulled the lead box from his coat and set it on the grating. He opened the lid, revealing the dull gray rods of refined tungsten. He connected the tungsten to the pulse generator using thin copper wire. The rods began to glow with a soft, pulsating amber light. He lowered the device on a long rope toward the plaza floor. It swung gently in the cold night air like a strange, glowing pendulum. He waited for the enforcer to look up and spot the artificial light. The man froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the hovering glow. Arthur jerked the rope, causing the light to dance across the plaza floor. The enforcer drew his blade, his hand shaking with a visible tremor. Arthur watched the chaos unfold as the thieves scrambled in different directions. They abandoned the crates, fearing the unknown source of the light. He pulled the device back up, his breath misting in the freezing air. The plaza below was now empty, save for the abandoned cargo. He descended the ladder and crossed the open space at a run. He pried open the lid of one of the heavy crates. Inside lay stacks of high-grade copper coils and rare vacuum tubes. These were the components needed to stabilize his next invention. He loaded his satchel until the leather straps groaned under the weight. He heard the distant sound of a whistle blowing in the upper streets. The guild had realized the power failure was no mere accident. Arthur abandoned the plaza, sprinting toward the shadows of the harbor district. His lungs burned, a sharp metallic tang filling his throat with each breath. He ducked behind a stack of rotting shipping containers near the water. The black surface of the river reflected the flickering lights of the city. He felt the weight of the stolen components pressing against his spine. He pulled the tungsten rods from his pocket and inspected them closely. The metal was pure, free of the impurities that plagued the guild's supply. He realized then that Beatrix had sent him on a fool's errand. She had hoped he would trigger a trap and be eliminated by the patrol. Instead, he had used her own resources to secure his independence. He looked back toward the silhouette of the Vane-Smythe estate. The tower windows were dark, mirroring the chaos he had sown below. He knew she would be watching, her patience wearing thin. He needed a place to hide while he assembled the final prototype. He spotted a small, dilapidated boat moored to a broken pier. He stepped onto the rotting wood, the boards creaking under his weight. He untied the fraying ropes and pushed off into the dark current. The water was thick with industrial sludge and floating debris. He rowed toward the far bank, where the city's ruins turned into marshland. The silence of the river was a sharp contrast to the noise of the bazaar. He reached a hidden cove sheltered by dense, overhanging willow branches. He dragged the boat onto the mud and covered it with reeds. He walked deeper into the brush until he found the entrance to a cave. The interior was dry and smelled of ancient stone and damp earth. He set his satchel down and pulled out the pulse generator. The device still flickered with a faint, residual energy. He began to arrange the tungsten rods in a precise circular pattern. His movements were steady, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. The cost of his work was a persistent, dull ache in his joints. He ignored the sensation, his mind mapping out the flow of current. He needed to create a stable arc of light that didn't consume fuel. This was the only way to break the guild's monopoly on heat. He picked up a small, sharpened chisel and began to etch runes into the stone. The symbols glowed faintly as he channeled his intent into the rock. The cave wall began to vibrate, a low hum resonating through his teeth. He connected the final copper wire to the central tungsten rod. The entire arrangement flared with a brilliant, blinding white light. The shadows in the cave retreated, revealing the walls covered in moss. He shielded his eyes, the intensity of the illumination stinging his skin. He had succeeded where the guild had failed for over a century. He watched the light stabilize, a steady, sun-like glow in the darkness. The air around the rods began to warm, the frost melting from his coat. He sank to the floor, his muscles finally succumbing to the exhaustion. He watched the light, his breathing slowing to a steady, rhythmic pace. The city above would wake to a different world tomorrow morning. He closed his eyes, the memory of the cold fading into the warmth. Outside, the river continued its slow crawl toward the polluted sea. He was the architect of this new, inevitable, and blinding dawn. The guild would come for him, but they would be hunting a ghost. He lay still, the soft glow of the tungsten his only companion. The darkness of the alleyways seemed a lifetime away from this sanctuary. He reached out and touched the warm air near the glowing rods. His fingers were no longer numb, the circulation returning with a sharp tingle. He had traded his safety for the power to change the future. The gamble had paid off, but the true test was yet to come. He looked at his hands, seeing the faint, glowing residue on his skin. The power was not a gift, but a responsibility he had chosen. He stood up and walked toward the entrance of the cave. The night sky was clear, the stars obscured by the city's thick smog. He began to plan the next phase of his silent, industrial revolution. He would build a network of these lights across the lower districts. The guild's control over the city depended on their monopoly of warmth. He would dismantle that power, one light at a time, in silence. He returned to his work, the rhythm of his tools filling the cave. The tungsten rods hummed in harmony with the pulsing energy he created. He was no longer a pawn, but the master of his own fate. The city remained in darkness, unaware of the sun hidden in the earth. He worked through the night, his focus unyielding and his vision clear. Each connection was a strike against the heart of the guild's reign. He felt the weight of the city pressing down on the cave roof. He did not fear the pressure, for he was the one holding the weight. The morning would come, and with it, the beginning of the end. He checked the alignment of the rods one final time before dawn. Everything was prepared, the circuit ready to be expanded and deployed. He sat in the center of the glow, feeling the warmth in his marrow. The game had shifted, and he was the one holding all the cards. He waited for the first light of the sun to touch the horizon. He was ready to ignite the world, not with fire, but with truth. The oil lamps flickered in unison across the Oakhaven skyline. High Prefect Mordecai Grimm stood on the balcony of the guild spire. He gestured once toward the central steam valve manifold. Every flame in the city vanished simultaneously as the gas lines shut. Total darkness swallowed the slums like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Arthur Penhaligon crouched in the alleyway behind the old textile mill. He watched the streetlights die and felt the sudden, biting chill. The air grew heavy with the smell of unburnt, raw fuel. He reached into his satchel to retrieve his portable vacuum bulb. His fingers brushed the glass, but his right hand refused to close. The skin of his forearm turned a pale, bruised shade of violet. He realized the thermal tax had finally claimed his motor control. He gasped as a sharp crystalline frost crept across his knuckles. The alley entrance echoed with the rhythmic thud of iron-soled boots. Shadow Watch inspectors marched into the street with heavy lead lanterns. They did not light the wicks, for they carried cold, iron truncheons. Arthur pressed his back against the damp, soot-stained brickwork. He squeezed his left hand into a fist to ground his fading focus. He needed to move before they swept the perimeter of the mill. He pushed off the wall and stumbled into the narrow, jagged gap. His right arm hung limp, a dead weight against his woolen coat. A Shadow Watch officer turned his head toward the sound of gravel. The officer pointed a gloved finger at the darkness of the passage. Arthur darted toward the cellar grate near the base of the foundation. He kicked the rusted iron lock with his remaining strength. The metal groaned and gave way, revealing a descent into the sewers. He slid into the darkness, his breath hitching in his chest. The cold of the underground tunnel bit into his lungs like needles. He pulled the small, flickering bulb from his satchel with his left hand. The filament pulsed with a weak, dying amber glow. It cast long, distorted shadows against the slick, mossy stone walls. He could hear the inspectors overhead, their voices muffled by stone. Grimm wanted the heretic, and he was willing to starve the city. Arthur looked at his paralyzed right hand and saw the veins darkening. The thermal tax demanded a price for every spark he had stolen. He crawled through the muck, his legs trembling from the exhaustion. The tunnel branched into 3 directions, all equally dark and silent. He saw a faint blue light emanating from the central storm drain. It was not the guild's oil, but the shimmer of phosphorescent algae. He moved toward the glow, hoping to lose his pursuers in the maze. The sound of boots above him accelerated into a frantic, heavy sprint. They knew he was wounded, and they knew he was slowing down. Arthur leaned against a rusted pipe to catch his shallow, ragged breath. He checked the bulb again, its glass surface cold to the touch. The filament flickered, desperate to maintain its connection to the vacuum. He realized then that darkness was not merely an absence of light. To the guild, the void was a tactical weapon of absolute control. He saw his own reflection in a stagnant pool of black water. His eyes were sunken, his face smeared with grease and dried blood. He was no longer the brilliant inventor who walked the paved streets. He was a hunted animal, stripped of his tools and his health. The inspectors reached the grate and poured into the tunnel below. They did not need light to see, for they knew the sewer layout. Arthur scrambled upward, his left hand gripping a protruding rebar rod. He hoisted himself into a secondary drainage pipe hidden by grime. He crawled until the sounds of the pursuit faded into the distance. He emerged into a forgotten cellar beneath the city's primary market. The room was filled with crates of rotting, unsold grain and silt. He slumped against a wooden pillar, his right arm twitching in pain. He watched the bulb in his hand, its light fading to a dull red. He knew he could not risk another surge of energy tonight. The city above remained silent, locked in the grip of the blackout. He understood now that Grimm was willing to kill the entire population. If the people could not see the light, they could not revolt. Arthur closed his eyes and listened to the drip of condensation. He was the only man in Oakhaven who could restore the sun. But his body was failing, and the darkness was becoming his home. He needed a new way to channel the current without his nerves. He stared at his useless frozen arm and envisioned a mechanical brace. He would build a frame of steel to carry the weight of the tax. He stood up, his legs shaking, and prepared to face the morning. The blackout would end, but the war for the light had begun. A heavy iron grate clattered against the cellar floor. Arthur collapsed onto the cold, damp earth of the basement. Dust motes danced in the dying amber light of his bulb. His left hand trembled as he clutched the glass housing. The silence of the market cellar felt thick and suffocating. Above him, the floorboards groaned under the weight of heavy footsteps. Shadow Watch patrols moved through the aisles of the market square. Their iron lanterns clicked shut, sealing them in absolute, practiced darkness. Arthur shifted his weight, wincing as his paralyzed arm dragged across the stones. He pushed his body behind a stack of rotted, burlap-wrapped grain crates. A single droplet of condensation fell from a wooden ceiling beam. It landed on his boot with a sharp, echoing splash. He watched the ripples of the puddle reflect the faint, dying glow. His right arm remained locked, the skin marbled with dark, pulsing veins. The thermal tax was not just an illness, but a physical anchor. It drew heat from his blood to fuel the unnatural light he created. His fingers clawed at his satchel, searching for a wrench or a screwdriver. He found only a scrap of rusted copper wire and a bent brass pin. A muffled shout erupted from the street level above the cellar. The Shadow Watch had reached the entrance of the textile mill. He saw the light of a distant, flickering torch through a floorboard gap. The beam swept across the ceiling like a predatory, searching eye. Arthur held his breath, pressing his forehead against the rough, splintered wood. The smell of wet earth and ancient fermenting grain filled his nostrils. He needed a conductive pathway that bypassed his own failing nervous system. His gaze fell upon a discarded, iron-bound trunk in the shadows. He crawled toward it, dragging his dead weight with agonizing, slow movements. The lock on the trunk was rusted, but the hinges were thick, solid steel. He pried at the metal with his working hand, his joints popping. The lid creaked upward, revealing a cache of forgotten brass clockwork gears. He pulled a heavy, circular gear from the pile, its edges serrated and sharp. His reflection stared back from the polished brass, distorted and gaunt. He pressed the gear against his frozen forearm, gauging the size and weight. If he could bridge the current, he could bypass the paralysis in his nerves. He jammed the copper wire into the center hole of the brass gear. The metal bit into his skin, cold and unforgiving against his bruised flesh. He winced as the wire pinched his wrist, securing the improvised brace. The floorboards above suddenly splintered with a deafening, sharp crack. A pair of heavy, iron-soled boots landed on the cellar floor. The inspector stood in the center of the room, his face masked in shadow. He did not carry a lantern, relying on the total absence of light. Arthur froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The inspector turned his head, his eyes adjusting to the deep subterranean gloom. He reached for a coiled, heavy chain hanging from his leather belt. Arthur gripped the brass gear, his left hand hovering over the bulb's filament. He knew the surge would be violent and potentially permanent. The inspector stepped forward, the sound of his boots crunching on broken glass. Arthur shoved his left thumb into the bulb's open contact point. The light flared, a brilliant, blinding white that tore through the cellar. The inspector shrieked, shielding his eyes as the sudden illumination seared his sight. Arthur felt a jolt of pure, frigid electricity snap through his right arm. The brass gear vibrated, humming with the force of the redirected current. His arm jerked forward, the muscles firing in a spasm of forced movement. He swung the heavy trunk lid upward, catching the inspector under the chin. The man stumbled backward, his iron boots sliding on the slick, muddy floor. Arthur scrambled to his feet, his balance failing as the current drained him. He lunged toward the cellar stairs, his boots slipping in the dark muck. The inspector recovered, swinging his chain in a wide, whistling arc. The iron links shattered a wooden crate, sending splinters flying into the air. Arthur ducked, the metal whistling inches above his hunched, desperate shoulders. He reached the base of the stairs and hauled himself up the frame. The light in his hand flickered, turning a sickly, bruised shade of violet. He burst through a narrow wooden door and into the alleyway beyond. The night air hit him like a physical blow, freezing his sweat. He ran toward the main thoroughfare, his right arm swinging in a jerky rhythm. The brass gear clattered against his wrist, held in place by the copper wire. Behind him, the cellar erupted with the sound of pursuit and heavy breathing. He turned a sharp corner, his boots skidding on the wet cobblestone road. The city was a tomb of silent, darkened windows and locked iron doors. Grimm's blackout had turned every street into a trap of uneven, treacherous terrain. Arthur saw a merchant's cart overturned in the middle of the intersection. He dove behind it, his lungs burning with the sharp, acidic taste of coal. He looked at the bulb, watching the filament fray and darken inside the glass. The thermal tax was escalating, consuming more than just his ability to move. His vision blurred at the edges, turning into a tunnel of gray static. He realized the guild had rigged the city's power grid to track surges. Any light he created acted as a beacon for the Shadow Watch trackers. He needed to move without using the bulb, relying on his failing senses. He placed the bulb carefully inside a heavy, lead-lined pouch in his bag. The sudden darkness was absolute, a void that pressed against his wide eyes. He stood up, his hands sliding along the cold, wet wood of the cart. He moved toward the docks, where the smell of salt and rot lingered. The Shadow Watch passed by the cart, their boots ringing on the stones. They stopped, sniffing the air for the ozone smell of his electrical discharge. Arthur stayed motionless, his breath held tight behind his aching, clenched teeth. One inspector stopped inches from the cart, his hand resting on his blade. The man peered into the darkness, his head tilting like a listening hound. Arthur reached into his pocket and felt the sharp edge of the brass pin. He threw the pin toward the far end of the street, aiming for a crate. The metal struck the wood with a loud, ringing ping in the silence. The inspector turned, his heavy boots clattering as he sprinted toward the sound. Arthur exhaled, his knees buckling as he slipped into the shadows of a warehouse. He reached the docks, where the water lapped against the rotted wooden pilings. The sea was a flat black sheet, reflecting nothing but the starless sky. He saw a small, abandoned fishing skiff tied to a rusted iron ring. He climbed into the boat, his hands trembling as he touched the damp wood. He needed to reach the far side of the bay to find a workshop. He untied the rope, the fraying fibers snapping with a dry, brittle sound. He pushed off from the dock, the boat drifting into the cold, silent current. The city retreated behind him, a jagged silhouette against the dim, gray horizon. He sat in the bottom of the skiff, his right arm throbbing with heat. The brass gear was searing now, burning a ring into his bruised flesh. He pulled the wire loose, the metal tearing at his skin with a hiss. He stared at the bulb, now a dead weight in his heavy leather bag. The blackout continued, a blanket of shadow that silenced the entire sprawling metropolis. He knew the guild would begin searching the harbor as soon as dawn broke. He looked at his hand, noticing the fingernails had turned a deep, obsidian black. The cost of his survival was written in the decay of his own body. He laid his head against the wooden bench, his eyes searching the dark. The water surged beneath the boat, carrying him away from the reach of Grimm. He felt the cold seep into his bones, a reminder of the coming winter. The city of Oakhaven was a prison, and he was the only key left. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic slapping of the tide. Tomorrow would bring the search, the struggle, and the inevitable, crushing weight of taxes. For now, the darkness was his only ally against the cold, iron law. He fell into a shallow, fitful sleep as the boat drifted toward the mist. The horizon remained empty, a void waiting to be filled with new light. The skiff bumped against the mossy stone of the canal wall. Arthur crawled onto the slippery ledge, his movements stiff and agonizing. He wrapped his blackening fingers in a strip of gray wool. The refinery loomed ahead like a jagged iron mountain against the clouds. Steam hissed from massive brass vents, painting the night in thick, suffocating fog. He adjusted the heavy worker's coat he had stolen from a drying line. He pulled the woolen cap low to hide the obsidian stain on his skin. A row of guards stood before the main loading gate. They leaned on heavy, oil-fed lanterns that cast long, grotesque shadows. Arthur reached into his bag and withdrew a forged guild requisition order. He walked toward the gate, his gait heavy and practiced. He mimicked the weary, disgruntled shuffle of a mid-level refinery technician. The lead guard stepped forward, his hand hovering over a rusted sidearm. Arthur held out the document with a trembling, gloved hand. The guard squinted at the seal, the paper damp with the night mist. Arthur spoke in a low, gravelly rasp about a sudden pressure leak. He gestured toward the main distribution hub with a look of feigned annoyance. The guard grunted and stepped aside, waving his lantern in a dismissive arc. Arthur passed through the gate, the heat of the facility pressing against his face. Pipes rattled overhead, vibrating with the volatile pressure of refined lumen oil. He navigated the maze of catwalks, his boots ringing on the steel grating. He reached the central hub, a cathedral of pressure gauges and brass valves. He pulled a small, delicate filament assembly from his inner coat pocket. It glowed with a faint, pulsing inner light that defied the gloom. He wedged the device into the primary pressure regulator's intake valve. The machine groaned as the filament reacted with the concentrated oil vapor. Arthur turned a small iron wheel, locking the device into the metal housing. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. He backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He walked toward the exit, his eyes fixed on the flickering pressure needles. The gauges climbed into the red, the needles trembling with mechanical strain. He burst through the service door and into the cool, damp alleyway. A sudden, deafening roar tore through the silent city air. The refinery's main stack erupted in a pillar of blinding, white-hot flame. Glass windows in surrounding tenements shattered, showering the street in shards. The ground shook as the internal storage tanks buckled under the surge. Arthur pressed himself into a doorway, shielding his eyes from the glare. The city's monopoly on heat production fractured in a single, violent heartbeat. Shadow watch lanterns flickered and died, unable to compete with the inferno. People poured out of their homes, their faces illuminated by the chaotic light. The smell of burnt oil and ozone filled the night air. Arthur watched as the crowd surged toward the refinery gates, shouting in defiance. The guild's control over the city's warmth vanished in the smoke. He turned his back on the flames, his right arm throbbing with phantom heat. He faded into the darkness of the lower slums, a ghost in the wake of his own fire. The revolution had finally begun, fueled by his stolen, shattered logic. A man in a heavy coat slumped against the brickwork of a dark alley. He watched the refinery fire crawl across the skyline like a dying orange beast. The heat from the explosion washed over the slums in waves of dry, metallic air. Arthur looked down at his right hand. The black obsidian stain now crept past his wrist, tracing thin, dark veins toward his elbow. He pulled the wool bandage tighter to choke off the sight of his own decay. A group of laborers sprinted past him, their faces smeared with soot and frantic joy. They carried iron crowbars and heavy wooden crates salvaged from the burning outer warehouses. The guild's iron control over the heating grid had collapsed in less than an hour. Arthur pushed himself off the wall, his legs feeling like leaden weights. He needed to reach the secondary storage depot before the Shadow Watch regained their composure. He skirted the edge of the mob, keeping his head down and his shoulders hunched. A patrol of armored enforcers turned the corner, their visors glinting in the firelight. They beat their batons against their shields, demanding the crowd disperse into the dark. Arthur ducked behind a stack of discarded shipping barrels. He held his breath as the heavy boots crunched past his hiding spot. One guard paused to look at the burning refinery, his hand gripping the hilt of a shock baton. The man's eyes scanned the shadows, searching for a face that didn't belong. Arthur pressed his back into the wet wood of the barrel, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched a drop of condensation roll down his sleeve, catching the faint, flickering glow of the fire. The guards continued their march, their armor clanking in a rhythmic, ominous cadence. He exhaled slowly, his lungs burning with the sharp, bitter scent of coal dust. He checked his pocket for the final copper shunt he had salvaged from the wreckage. It felt cold, a stark contrast to the burning sensation radiating from his arm. The depot sat 2 blocks away, a fortress of reinforced steel and locked gates. He adjusted his stolen coat, trying to mimic the gait of a panicked citizen. The streetlights had all flickered out, leaving the district in a state of unnatural, jagged gloom. He navigated the maze of trash heaps and overturned carts with practiced, frantic speed. A woman stood in the middle of the road, clutching a bundle of rags to her chest. She stared at the flames with a look of hollow, terrifying relief. Arthur didn't stop, his gaze fixed on the heavy padlock of the depot's side entrance. He reached the gate and pressed his ear against the cold, vibrating metal. The sound of frantic shouting echoed from within the facility. Guild clerks were scrambling to secure the remaining fuel logs before the looters arrived. He pulled a thin, serrated blade from his boot, sliding it into the lock's mechanism. He didn't use logic or light here, just the raw, physical frustration of a man with nothing left. The tumblers clicked, the heavy iron bolt sliding back with a sharp, final crack. He slipped inside the dark warehouse, the air thick with the smell of unrefined oil. Rows of pressurized canisters stretched into the darkness, glimmering like dormant metallic giants. He moved toward the main cooling valve, his boots crunching on scattered glass. The floor felt uneven, shifting slightly under his weight. He found the primary pressure gauge, its needle buried deep in the yellow caution zone. He jammed the copper shunt into the release port, forcing the mechanism to accept a bypass. The machine let out a high-pitched, agonizing whine that set his teeth on edge. He turned the valve, not to release the pressure, but to seal it inside the loop. The pipework began to shudder, the metal groaning under the strain of contained, liquid fire. He didn't wait to see the result, slipping back out into the cool night air. He ducked behind a stone fountain just as a muffled boom rocked the ground. The warehouse doors blew outward, showering the alley in splinters of wood and twisted steel. A fountain of pressurized, freezing gas erupted into the sky, extinguishing the nearby street fires. The sudden drop in temperature was immediate, a biting, glacial wind that hit the street. The rioters stopped in their tracks, looking up at the plume of white vapor. The city's reliance on the guild's oil was failing, replaced by the chaotic, uncontrolled cold. Arthur watched the guards stumble, their heavy coats frozen stiff by the sudden rapid expansion of gas. He turned toward the harbor, knowing the city would be paralyzed by the shift in pressure. His arm throbbed, the obsidian mark pulsing with a faint, rhythmic, and sickly violet light. He was the ghost in the machine, and the city was finally beginning to wake up. He stepped over a pile of broken bricks, his path leading toward the dark, churning water. The guild would hunt him now, but they would be shivering while they did it. He reached the docks, his breath coming in ragged, visible clouds. The skiff waited in the shadows, rocking gently against the rotting wooden pilings. He climbed inside, his fingers numb and trembling from the sudden biting chill. He looked back at the city one last time, a jagged silhouette of smoke and frost. The revolution had no leader, only a series of broken pipes and shattered monopolies. He pushed off the dock, the oars dipping into the dark, silent water. The distance between him and the shore grew with every stroke. He felt the weight of the city's future pressing down on his tired, aching shoulders. The water was black, swallowing the reflection of the dying, burning refinery. He rode into the mist, a shadow drifting toward the unknown, frozen horizon. The harbor mist clung to his skin like a damp, freezing shroud. He pulled his collar high to hide the jagged scar running along his jaw. The skiff bumped against a rusted iron ladder protruding from the harbor wall. He climbed the slick rungs, his boots scraping against algae-covered metal. Above the docks, the central refinery loomed like a dormant mountain of soot and iron. Steam hissed from cracked vents, creating a veil of white noise that masked his approach. He kept his head low, mimicking the slumped posture of a dockworker returning from a double shift. A patrol of guild enforcers marched toward the gate, their boots crushing shards of fallen glass. He stepped into the shadow of a freight crane, holding his breath as the heavy boots crunched nearby. One guard paused to adjust his goggles, his eyes scanning the gloom with mechanical detachment. Arthur leaned against the crane's base, tracing the cold rivets with his gloved fingers. He pulled a forged work permit from his inner pocket, its edges frayed to mimic years of wear. The guard's gaze drifted toward him, sharp and hungry for a reason to exert authority. Arthur held out the document with a steady, practiced tremor in his hand. He muttered a complaint about a faulty pressure gauge in Sector 4. The guard grunted, waving him through with a dismissive flick of a gloved hand. Arthur didn't look back as he crossed the threshold into the inner courtyard. The air here tasted of ozone and heavy, unrefined oil. Massive copper pipes snaked across the ceiling, vibrating with the pulse of the city's heat supply. He walked past rows of steaming tanks, his eyes tracking the flow of glowing coolant. The refinery's core sat behind a wall of reinforced glass and brass gears. He spotted the chief engineer sitting at a console, his fingers dancing over a row of brass levers. The man's face was obscured by the glare of a flickering monitor. Arthur moved toward the secondary intake manifold, his gait slow and deliberate. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small glass-encased capacitor. It hummed with a faint, rhythmic vibration that made his teeth ache. He knelt by the manifold, pretending to tighten a loose bolt on the floor plate. His hands moved with calculated grace, sliding the capacitor into the intake's hidden slot. The machine's internal fan groaned, struggling against the foreign object wedged in its path. He stood up, wiping grease onto his trousers to seal the ruse. The chief engineer shouted something about a drop in line pressure. Arthur offered a quick, deferential nod before turning toward the secondary exit. The floor beneath him shuddered as the capacitor began to draw power from the main grid. Lights throughout the refinery flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. A warning siren groaned to life, low and dissonant like a dying beast. He pushed through the heavy steel door, stepping back into the biting cold of the street. The sky above the refinery ignited with a sudden blinding flash of violet light. A tremor rippled through the pavement, toppling stacks of fuel crates in the alleyway. People spilled from their cramped shanties, their faces illuminated by the failing glow of the city's heart. The heat in the air vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp drop in atmospheric pressure. Frost began to spiderweb across the brick walls, sparkling in the harsh light of the overload. He melted into the chaotic crowd, his movements fluid and unseen. The guild's monopoly was bleeding out, the heat dying in the pipes that fed the city. He glanced back once, seeing the refinery's main stack shudder and tilt precariously. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising in a roar of long-denied desperation. He tightened his grip on his satchel, feeling the remaining parts clatter inside. The path ahead led toward the lower slums, where the cold was already beginning to bite. He moved with the current of the mob, a silent architect in the midst of a collapse. The city's infrastructure was a brittle shell, and he had just shattered the foundation. He felt a thin line of blood trace down from his nose, warm against the frozen air. He wiped it away with his sleeve, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The power had shifted, and the city would never be warm again. He turned a corner, leaving the flickering ruins behind him. His steps were rhythmic, echoing against the damp cobblestones of the narrow passage. He reached the edge of the industrial district, where the streetlights had already gone completely dark. The silence here was absolute, save for the distant, muffled sound of breaking glass. He stepped into the shadows of a soot-stained archway. He was no longer just a ghost in the machine, he was the catalyst for the end. Arthur crouched in the rafters of a derelict textile mill. Dust motes danced in a thin shaft of moonlight piercing the rotted roof. Below him, Shadow Watch inspectors dragged a shackled figure across the splintered floorboards. It was Elias, the old clockmaker who had taught Arthur the basics of gear ratios. Elias stumbled, his knees hitting the wood with a dull, sickening thud. A Shadow Watch officer kicked the old man in the ribs, forcing a jagged gasp from his lungs. The officer held a glowing oil lamp close to Elias's bruised face. He demanded the location of the hidden schematics for the vacuum-sealed filament. Elias coughed, a spray of dark blood staining his ragged tunic. He spat at the officer's polished boots, his defiance absolute. Arthur clutched his satchel, his knuckles white against the worn leather straps. Inside the bag, the original blueprints felt heavy, like a lead weight pressing against his ribs. His fingers brushed the cold glass casing of a prototype bulb stored in the side pocket. The thermal tax flared in his chest, a sharp, icy needle pricking at his heart. He knew if he descended now, the Shadow Watch would cut him down in seconds. The blueprints were the only record of the Lumen logic that could liberate Oakhaven. If he lost them, the guild would remain the sole masters of the city's heat. An inspector pulled a heavy iron rod from a nearby rack. He slammed the metal into the floorboards just inches from Elias's trembling hand. The old man didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the shadows above. Arthur saw the silent plea in his mentor's gaze, a quiet request for him to remain hidden. The officer raised the rod, his face twisted into a mask of cruel anticipation. Arthur's breath hitched, the cold air burning his lungs like liquid nitrogen. He could leap from the rafters and create a blinding flash to distract them. The resulting thermal tax would paralyze his legs, leaving him defenseless on the floor. He looked at the blueprints again, the ink lines detailing the future of the city. He looked at Elias, whose life was flickering like a dying candle in a gale. The officer swung the iron rod with a brutal downward arc. A crunch of bone echoed through the silent, cavernous mill. Arthur didn't move, his body frozen in a rigid, statuesque pose. He watched as Elias slumped, his head lolling forward toward the blood-stained floor. The inspectors began to search the room, their movements methodical and bored. Arthur turned his back on the scene, his jaw set in a hard, frozen line. He crawled toward the ventilation shaft, his movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to fight, to die alongside his friend. He crushed that instinct, burying his grief beneath a layer of cold, calculated logic. The blueprints were safe, and that was the only variable that mattered now. He squeezed through the narrow metal opening, the sharp edges slicing his palms. He did not look back at the screams that followed him into the night. Outside, the city of Oakhaven lay under a shroud of thick, suffocating fog. He stepped onto the slick cobblestones, his eyes reflecting the dull glow of the oil lamps. The moral idealist who had once sought to save the slums had died in that mill. In his place stood a man with a heart forged of cold, unyielding carbon. He walked toward the industrial sector, his pace steady and terrifyingly precise. The guild would pay for their arrogance, but not through simple, clumsy riots. He would dismantle them from within, using their own greed as the catalyst. His hand trembled once, a ghost of his former humanity fighting for control. He forced his fingers to relax, clenching the satchel tight against his side. He reached the edge of the canal, where the water churned with toxic, oily sludge. He tossed his old, frayed cloak into the dark, swirling depths. He adjusted his collar, his expression as empty and dark as the night sky. The blueprints were his only anchor, and he would let nothing else weigh him down. He vanished into the labyrinth of alleys, a shadow moving toward a greater, darker purpose. The fog clung to the canal's surface like a shroud of damp wool. Arthur pulled the collar of his coat tight against the biting chill. His breath plumed in the air, a ghost of heat departing his body. He reached the iron gate of the guild's secondary record vault. A single brass key dangled from the lock, left by a distracted guard. He slid the key into the tumbler with a metallic click. The heavy door groaned, swinging inward to reveal shelves of ledger books. Rows of dust-covered volumes stretched into the dark, smelling of rot and ink. He scanned the spines for the seal of the Thermal Oversight Committee. His fingers traced the leather bindings, searching for the hidden tax codes. A flicker of movement caught his peripheral vision near the back wall. He ducked behind a stack of crates as a lantern beam swept the room. The light illuminated a desk piled with confiscated property from the slums. A brass compass and a tattered journal sat atop the mound of debris. The journal belonged to Elias, its cover scorched by the lantern's heat. Arthur reached out, his hand hovering over the familiar worn leather. He pulled his hand back, his fingers curling into a tight white fist. The blueprints in his satchel felt like a burning coal against his hip. He shoved the journal aside, burying it beneath a heavy ledger. He opened his own satchel and laid the blueprints across the desk. He needed to cross-reference the guild's intake logs with his own designs. The ink on the page shimmered under the dim, artificial light. A blue window flickered into existence, projecting a grid of light above the map. It displayed the city's power conduits in a web of glowing red lines. He traced the path of the main pipeline with a steady, calloused finger. The guild was siphoning heat from the common districts to power the spire. He tapped a specific junction on the map, highlighting a valve control. A notification appeared in white text, indicating a high-pressure bypass. He pulled a small mechanical stylus from his pocket, scratching a new route. The logic was simple, a subtraction of energy from the ruling elite. He memorized the sequence of the bypass, his eyes darting across the grid. His mind processed the gear ratios needed to trigger the chain reaction. He closed the interface, the blue light fading into the room's gloom. A heavy boot scraped against the stone floor outside the vault. He flattened himself against the wall, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. The shadow of a guard stretched across the threshold, long and jagged. Arthur grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the workbench near his feet. He gripped the cold metal, the weight grounding his trembling nerves. The guard stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. He carried a spear tipped with a jagged, glowing piece of refined coal. Arthur lunged from the shadows, his movement a blur of calculated violence. He struck the guard's temple with the heavy end of the wrench. The man crumpled without a sound, his lantern shattering on the stone floor. Oil pooled around the broken glass, catching the faint glint of the moon. Arthur stepped over the body, his face devoid of any lingering hesitation. He retrieved the guard's keyring, looking for the bypass access code. A silver tag caught the light, stamped with the mark of the refinery. He tucked the metal disc into his pocket, his pulse slowing to a crawl. He stepped out into the hallway, the air thick with the smell of sulfur. The walls were lined with copper pipes that vibrated with rhythmic pressure. He pressed his ear to the metal, listening to the flow of steam. The pitch of the vibration told him everything he needed to know. The guild was pushing the system to its absolute breaking limit. He began to walk, his stride matching the cadence of the humming pipes. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors with the precision of a clockwork gear. A group of workers shuffled toward him, their heads bowed in exhaustion. He pulled his hat low, blending into the stream of gray, soot-stained bodies. They were ghosts in the machine, hollowed out by the city's endless greed. He reached the central junction, a massive chamber of spinning brass wheels. Steam hissed from the joints, coating the room in a layer of grime. He climbed the maintenance ladder, his boots ringing against the iron rungs. At the top, he found the control console, a mess of levers and dials. He pulled the silver tag from his pocket and inserted it into the slot. The console groaned as the mechanisms aligned, the gears shifting into position. A warning light pulsed on the panel, a deep and rhythmic amber. He adjusted the secondary intake valve, cutting the supply to the guild spire. The pipes groaned in protest, the pressure mounting behind the locked gate. He turned the final dial, locking the setting into the iron frame. The room began to shake, the floor plates rattling against the stone foundation. He descended the ladder, his movements efficient and utterly devoid of fear. The sound of alarms echoed through the refinery, a shrill, piercing shriek. Guards rushed toward the chamber, their shouts muffled by the venting steam. Arthur slipped into a narrow service duct just as the doors burst open. He crawled through the dark, the metal walls scraping his shoulders raw. He emerged onto a high catwalk overlooking the city's main steam vent. Below, the pipes began to glow a violent, angry shade of white. The pressure reached the threshold, the metal groaning under the immense strain. He watched as the first valve blew, a plume of superheated vapor erupting. The sound was like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundations of the district. The guild's control center dimmed, the lights flickering and dying in sequence. He stood on the catwalk, his silhouette framed against the smoke and steam. The city fell into a sudden, absolute darkness as the power grid failed. He felt the cold air rush in, a draft that promised a long, brutal winter. He turned toward the horizon, where the spire still stood, a dark monolith. His hands were steady, his gaze fixed on the path of his next design. The memory of the mill faded, replaced by the cold reality of the map. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a variable in his own equation. He stepped into the night, the blueprints tucked safely against his heart. The city belonged to the dark now, and he was its silent architect. Arthur crouched on the rusted iron catwalk overlooking Oakhaven's central plaza. His fingers worked with agonizing slowness, wrapping copper wire around a series of glass vacuum chambers. Each bulb was larger than his previous prototypes, housing thick, hand-spun carbonized bamboo filaments. The air in the plaza below remained thick with the acrid, familiar smog of burning lumen oil. Shadow Watch sentries patrolled the perimeter, their lanterns casting long, sickly yellow flickers against the cobblestones. Arthur adjusted the focus of his first array, a heavy brass housing bolted to a structural support beam. He checked his pocket watch, the ticking rhythm muffled by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city's steam pipes. The thermal tacks clawed at his chest, a sensation of freezing needles piercing his lungs as he siphoned the ambient heat. He ignored the frost creeping over his knuckles and tightened the final terminal screw. A blue spark jumped from the filament, a tiny, defiant star trapped within the glass. He moved to the second array, slipping silently across the slick, rain-dampened rooftop. Below, a Shadow Watch inspector stopped, sniffing the air as if he detected the sharp scent of ozone. Arthur froze, pressing his back against a stone chimney and holding his breath until his vision grayed. The inspector moved on, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. Arthur reached the second junction, a junction box hidden beneath a loose slate tile. He spliced his array into the guild's primary power line, his hands trembling from the lingering cold of the tacks. The connection hissed, a faint, high-pitched whine emanating from the wires as they drew power from the city's own veins. He scrambled down the maintenance ladder, his boots landing silently in the soot-stained alleyway. He pulled a small silver trigger from his coat, a simple switch etched with a jagged lightning bolt. The city waited, suffocated by the dim, controlled glow of the guild's sanctioned lamps. Arthur pressed the switch. The plaza exploded in a sudden brilliant flash of pure white light. The street lamps flickered and shattered, unable to compete with the sheer intensity of the array. Shadow Watch sentries dropped their oil lanterns, shielding their eyes as the darkness that protected them vanished instantly. People emerged from the slums, blinking as the blinding, unforgiving radiance washed away the city's perpetual gloom. The aesthetic of Oakhaven shifted in a single heartbeat, from oppressive shadow to clinical, piercing clarity. High Prefect Mordecai Grimm appeared on the balcony of the spire, his face etched with confusion as he scanned the blinding plaza. The light revealed the grime on the walls, the decay of the streets, and the terrified faces of the enforcers. Arthur retreated into the deep shadows of the industrial district, his work already complete. He watched from a distance as a group of citizens pointed toward the spire, their voices rising in a growing, unified roar. The Guild's psychological dominance, built entirely on the fear of the dark, fractured beneath the weight of the illumination. Arthur felt the cold bite of the tax receding, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. He pulled his collar up against the biting wind, his silhouette fading into the periphery of the city. The narrative of the Guild had been shattered by a simple, blinding truth. He looked at his hands, finding them pale and shivering, the skin mapped with faint, frost-bitten scars. A crowd surged toward the plaza, their movements no longer hesitant or cowed by the flickering oil lamps. The Shadow Watch retreated, their weapons useless in the glare of the artificial sun. Arthur walked toward the edge of the district, his footsteps steady on the uneven ground. The blueprints for the next phase were tucked securely into his inner pocket, heavy and cold. He knew the Guild would search every corner of Oakhaven for the source of the light. He didn't look back at the plaza, where his arrays continued to burn with relentless white intensity. The era of the dim light regime had ended in a flash of electrical brilliance. He disappeared into the labyrinthine alleys, a ghost, leaving behind a world that would never be dark again. The spire's floodlights sputtered, their orange glow dying against the encroaching white radiance. Arthur watched the transition from the safety of a rusted ventilation shaft. A Shadow Watch officer stumbled backward, his hand clutching a useless, extinguished oil lantern. The man's eyes squinted against the harsh, artificial glare pouring from the rooftops. Arthur shifted his weight, the metal grating groaning under his boots. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a heavy, brass-cased capacitor. The device hummed with a low, vibrating intensity that rattled his teeth. He wedged the capacitor behind a loose structural pipe. This single component acted as a surge stabilizer for the entire district's grid. Without it, the light would fade within minutes as the current surged and collapsed. He wired the lead into the main steam conduit with practiced, rapid motions. His fingers were numb, the skin turning a bruised shade of violet. The thermal tax was no longer a stinging needle, but a heavy, leaden weight. He leaned his forehead against the cold, damp stone of the chimney. Below, the crowd gathered in the plaza, their shadows stretching long and thin. A woman pointed at the spire, her finger trembling with an unfamiliar righteous fury. She held a jagged piece of slate, her knuckles white from the grip. The collective silence of the slums broke into a low, rumbling murmur. Arthur watched as the murmurs coalesced into a singular, rhythmic chant. The sound rose toward the spire like a physical wave. Grimm remained frozen on his balcony, his gloved hand gripping the stone railing. The prefect's face was washed out, the lack of shadow revealing every wrinkle of his panic. Arthur pulled a small, glass-encased relay from his pocket. This component was the final piece of his long-range control mechanism. He slotted the relay into the junction box with a satisfying metallic click. The air around the box rippled, the ozone scent thickening into a metallic tang. He stood up, his knees popping from the strain of the cramped position. A stray spark jumped from the junction, singing the edge of his woolen coat. He ignored the smell of scorched fabric and turned toward the fire escape. The ladder was slick with condensation, the iron steps vibrating under his weight. He descended into the alley, his boots splashing through a shallow pool of oily runoff. Shadow Watch patrols were abandoning their posts, their weapons slung over their backs. They retreated toward the spire, their formations ragged and disorganized. Arthur ducked behind a stack of rotting wooden crates as a squad rushed past. He held his breath until his lungs ached, his eyes fixed on the damp pavement. The squad leader barked a command, his voice cracking with uncharacteristic fear. The soldiers scrambled away, leaving their heavy, armored cloaks on the cobblestones. Arthur stepped out from behind the crates once the alley was empty. He reached the primary distribution hub, a massive iron cabinet bolted to the wall. He inserted a master override key into the cabinet's rusted locking mechanism. The internal gears groaned, resisting the turn for a heartbeat before snapping into place. A series of glowing filaments ignited behind the cabinet's reinforced glass panel. They pulsed in time with his own ragged, exhausted heartbeat. The light bled through the cracks in the cabinet, illuminating the surrounding brickwork. Arthur retreated into the deeper darkness of a nearby cellar entrance. He watched the hub feed the remaining arrays across the district. The white light intensified, turning the plaza into a stage of clinical, unforgiving visibility. Every piece of trash, every cracked window, and every stain on the street stood exposed. The myth of the Guild's omnipotence relied on the concealment of the dark. Arthur watched as the illusion dissolved under the relentless, steady illumination. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his inner pocket. He scribbled a single jagged mark in the margin of his technical schematics. The mark signified the completion of the first phase of his design. He felt a sharp, cold sting in his palm, a reminder of the energy he had siphoned. He clenched his fist, the skin tight and unresponsive. He needed to move before the Guild realized the source of the surge. He turned into the maze of back alleys, his pace steady despite the fatigue. The city around him was changing, the architecture appearing sharper in the light. He passed a row of tenements where doors were swinging open. People spilled into the streets, their faces illuminated by the reflected glow. They looked at each other, the fear of the dark replaced by a sudden, dangerous curiosity. Arthur kept his head down, his silhouette blending into the shifting shadows of the walls. He reached a junction where the light was still flickering, struggling against the distance. He tapped a wall-mounted control box, his touch enough to steady the flow. The light snapped into a sharp, constant beam that cut through the fog. He heard the sound of approaching heavy boots on the main thoroughfare. He darted into a narrow gap between two crumbling brick buildings. The space was tight, his shoulders scraping against the rough, abrasive surfaces. He squeezed through to the other side, finding himself in the old shipping sector. The docks were empty, the cranes standing like skeletal sentinels against the horizon. He climbed the rusted ladder of a crane, his movements fluid and practiced. From the top, he had a clear view of the entire city grid. The district was a geometric web of white, glowing lines intersecting in the dark. He saw the spire, a dark, isolated needle surrounded by a sea of brilliance. The guild's control was limited now to the high, unreachable levels of the building. He felt a moment of cold, calculating satisfaction as he scanned the layout. He pulled a small, brass-cased telescope from his belt. He focused on the spire's main entry gates, currently reinforced with heavy steel plates. A group of civilians was approaching the gate, their movements slow and deliberate. They carried lengths of discarded pipe and heavy iron tools. Arthur watched them test the strength of the hinges with a practiced, heavy strike. The gate shuddered, the metal groaning under the pressure of the improvised battering ram. He knew the guild would attempt a lockdown, sealing the spire against the uprising. He needed to ensure the light held long enough for the city to react. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a final, delicate glass tube. It contained a concentrated, pressurized gas that would override the spire's internal climate controls. He aimed his prototype launcher at the spire's ventilation intake, high on the western face. The launcher was a compact brass construction, its spring tension set to the maximum. He took a steadying breath, his hands finally ceasing their rhythmic tremor. He pulled the trigger, the mechanism clicking with a sharp, resonant sound. The glass tube arched through the air, a small, dark projectile against the white glare. It struck the intake grill, shattering upon impact with a faint, crystalline pop. A cloud of pale, swirling vapor began to seep into the spire's inner chambers. Arthur watched as the internal lights of the spire began to flicker and dim. The guild's sanctuary was being compromised from the inside out. He lowered the launcher, his breath hitching as the cold weight settled back into his chest. The thermal tax was demanding its due, his vision blurring at the edges. He gripped the crane's railing, his knuckles turning white as he fought to remain conscious. He looked down at his hands, finding them covered in a fine crystalline frost. He wiped the ice away, the skin beneath raw and sensitive. The city below erupted in a cheer, a sound that carried over the rooftops. He turned away from the view, his silhouette fading into the industrial haze. He descended the crane with agonizing slowness, his legs feeling like dead wooden stumps. He reached the ground and collapsed against the base of the structure. The light from his arrays bathed him in a cold, clinical glow. He pulled the blueprints from his pocket, his fingers fumbling with the edges. The paper was damp, the ink smudging under his trembling touch. He needed to reach the secondary bunker before the guild regained their footing. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest against the exertion. He limped toward the edge of the shipping district, his shadow cast long before him. He was a ghost in his own creation, a phantom architect of a new world. The city continued to roar behind him, a sound of shifting tides. He stepped into the dark, narrow passage that led toward the outskirts. The white light faded, replaced by the natural, oppressive gloom of the outer alleys. He kept moving, his pace picking up as the adrenaline finally began to fade. His goal was not the plaza, but the heart of the city's power infrastructure. He had exposed the guild, but he had yet to dismantle their foundation. He reached a heavy iron door, his hands finding the hidden release mechanism. The door swung open, revealing a tunnel that stretched deep into the earth. He stepped inside, the darkness closing around him like a heavy, velvet shroud. He didn't look back at the city, his focus fixed on the path ahead. The blueprints were safe, and the city was awake, its eyes finally opened to the truth. He descended into the tunnel, his boots echoing against the wet stone floor. The air grew colder, the scent of damp earth filling his lungs. He was the variable that had tipped the scale, the anomaly in the guild's equation. The tunnel was silent, the roar of the city fading into a distant, muffled hum. He touched the rough wall of the tunnel, feeling the pulse of the city's veins. He would build something new, something that didn't depend on the guild's shadows. He reached the end of the passage, where a heavy, reinforced vault door stood waiting. He placed his hand against the scanner, his pulse syncing with the machine's rhythm. The door groaned, the locking tumblers shifting with a series of sharp mechanical clicks. He entered the vault, the space filled with the silent, dormant potential of his research. He sat on a small wooden stool, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion. He watched the flickering blue light of his portable array on the workbench. It was the only source of illumination in the vast subterranean chamber. He leaned back, his eyes closing as the silence of the vault enveloped him. The city above would burn in the light he had provided. The guild would struggle to regain control, but the narrative had shifted forever. He was the silent architect, and his work was only just beginning. He pulled a thin woolen blanket over his shoulders, his shivering finally subsiding. The cold was a constant companion, but for the first time, it felt manageable. He watched the blue spark in the glass, a tiny defiant star in the dark. He drifted into a shallow sleep, his dreams filled with equations and light. The city continued to roar, a distant sound of change that he had set in motion. He was the ghost of Oakhaven, the architect of a new, illuminated era. The vault remained silent, a sanctuary of cold, calculated potential. He would wake, he would refine his designs, and he would finish the work. The guild had no idea what had truly been unleashed within their walls. He was the variable that would never be solved, the shadow that had brought the light. High Prefect Mordecai Grimm stood atop the central dais of the guild headquarters. He gripped an ornamental cane carved from deep-crust iron. Behind him, the massive oil pressure gauges vibrated with a rhythmic, metallic thud. Arthur Penhaligon emerged from the shadows of the ventilation shaft. His coat hung in tatters, stained with the soot of a dozen districts. He kept his right arm pressed against his side to hide the tremors. Grimm gestured toward the flickering lamps that lined the vaulted ceiling. He sneered at the inventor, his voice echoing against the cold stone walls. Arthur reached into his satchel and withdrew a singular, oversized glass filament. It glowed with an unstable, violent violet hue. He didn't speak, but his eyes tracked the main power conduit running beneath the dais. Grimm signaled to the Shadow Watch guards flanking the chamber. They drew their long, serrated bayonets with a unified, scraping sound. Arthur dropped the filament into the master intake valve. A sharp, crystalline crack echoed through the vast hall. The thermal tax hit Arthur with the force of a falling anvil. His skin turned translucent as the heat was siphoned directly from his veins. He fell to his knees, his breath forming thick, icy clouds in the air. The entire guild headquarters groaned as the electrical surge hit the oil lines. Massive pipes burst, spraying pressurized fuel that immediately ignited into white-hot pillars. Grimm lost his footing, his cane clattering across the marble floor. The ceiling lamps shattered one by one, showering the guards in jagged glass. Arthur crawled toward the central desk as the structure began to buckle. He pulled a leather-bound folio from a hidden compartment beneath the desk. His fingers brushed a seal bearing a symbol he had never seen before, a sun eclipsed by a gear. He flipped the parchment open, his eyes scanning the elegant, cold calligraphy. The document detailed the exact timeline of his own research and development. It listed his breakthroughs as controlled variables in a long-term social experiment. The date on the final page matched the day of his very first experiment. He was never the architect of a new era, but a calculated catalyst. The entire guild had been a sandbox designed to test his specific capacity for innovation. Arthur crumpled the paper into his freezing palm. The floor beneath him collapsed into the churning furnace of the basement. The guild headquarters groaned, then folded inward like a discarded toy. Arthur stood amidst the wreckage, his body numb and his purpose stripped away. The light of the burning oil reflected in his hollow, exhausted eyes. He realized then that the darkness he fought had been a cage, but the light he brought was merely a different set of bars. The conspiracy stretched far beyond Oakhaven, reaching into the hands of invisible masters who had watched every step he took. You watched him build a sun, and you cheered as the shadows fell. You thought you were witnessing a revolution, but you were only watching the clockwork turn. The light you see in your own room tonight isn't yours. It's a wire they're holding, and you're just the next bulb they plan to burn out.